Good evening or good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the event, What Does the Media Concentration Do to a Country, as part of this year's Media Democracy Festival organized by the Media Reform Coalition. The Media Reform Coalition works to bring together civil society groups, organizations, and media practitioners to develop policies and campaigns for media reform in light of a communications environment that continues to be dominated by a handful of large, powerful organizations and is characterized by insufficient plurality, diversity, and accountability. I am Bene Brevini, Associate Professor of Communication at the University of Sydney, and I'm chairing today's discussion. So, the COVID pandemic has shown more than ever the vital role of healthy communication institutions in providing information that the public can trust and in acting as famous interrogators of power. Unfortunately, unchecked media concentration has been growing in the last 20 years in a number of Western countries as a result of deregulation and privatization. This has allowed some media groups to accumulate vast amounts of revenue and influence with catastrophic consequences for the proper conduct of democracy. So in what ways media concentration can have a detrimental impact on democracy? I'll give you a few proven examples. Firstly, it can lead to excessive influence of media owners or advertising clients on politicians and government, and the manipulation of political decisions in favor of hidden economic interest. Secondly, it can reduce the quality of journalism, investigative or otherwise, restricting the degrees of editorial freedom and the erosion of the quality of working conditions and job security for journalists. Third, it generally leads to lack of media ownership transparency and opacity of funding sources. Further, it leads to excess power of media executives over political decision-making. And as the Leveson inquiry demonstrated in the UK, it leads to a reduced sense of public responsibility in media institutions, a reduced sense of the ethical role of these institutions in a given society. And finally, it can lead to the capturing of public policy and often to regulatory capture, meaning that independent authority that are supposed to regulate the media systems can also be captured. So to discuss what does media concentration do to a country, we chose the case of Australia. Why Australia? Well, because Australia has the most highly concentrated media system in liberal democracies in the world. Yeah, that's right. And one company, News Corporation, is the unchallenged dominant player in the print market, owning 59% share of the metropolitan and national markets by readership. We also chose Australia because over a year ago, a petition for a royal commission into media diversity received over 500,000 signatures of concerned Australian citizens. This kind of public engagement is extraordinary in the history of global media reforms movement. So it is really a first also for the Media Reform Coalition and the Media Democracy Festival. It is also a testament to the increased awareness of the Australian public that something is wrong with their media and their clear demand to change it. But as we know too well, the path towards reform is never an easy one. So on the 11th of November 2020, the Australian Senate referred an inquiry into the state of media diversity in Australia, and the inquiry was concluded just a few months ago in December 2021. So I couldn't be more honored to be able to discuss what does media concentration do to a country with three of the key people that have been at the forefront of this battle to reform Australian media. So let me welcome Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, a Green senator for South Australia. She chaired the Senate inquiry into media diversity in Australia. She holds the Australian Greens portfolio for arts, media and communication, environment and water, transport, infrastructures, and tourism. Then we have Tosca Lloyd. Tosca is a senior campaign manager at GetUp for the past 3 years. She has focused primarily on media and democracy campaigns, including on press freedom, media diversity, and the protection of public broadcasting. Michael Ward Michael, for over 20 years, worked as a senior executive at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, including as head of television policy and general manager. He also worked in Australian media policy, holding senior positions with Australian Federal Agency, and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney. So each of our guests will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll all come together for a discussion. If you would like to ask a question, please add it to the comment stream on the platform you're watching, and we will take as many as we can. Michael, I will start with you. Could you give us a review of the current state of the media in Australia?
Okay, thanks, Bene, and good evening to everyone, and good morning to my colleagues here. I just want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land for where I'm speaking, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to them as the traditional and ongoing owners and their elders past and present, and to any First Nations people here for this session. I want to very quickly give you some data, lots of data and figures, and as I do that, I'm going to try and share something from my computer, which is not actually going to do it easily, so I'm not going to spend time sharing the screen because it's going to ask me for all sorts of preferences as I do that. So what I'm going to do is just quickly then go through some of the issues that came up when we published the report, Who Controls Our Media, last April. It was published by GetUp, and it was I'm going to put a link in so you can follow this discussion if you want to look more closely at the information. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it was because I've updated some of the data to show just how much has been a further concentration of media power in this country. But just to quickly begin, some key data about Australia. There's 25 million people living in a country the size of Europe. 70% of those people live in 5 very small areas, the geographical areas of Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. And I'll make reference to that a few times because they're the major media markets, and they are dominated even more closely by just a couple of companies. Australian television and radio has historically been dominated by, consisted of free-to-air services. Subscription television came to Australia only in 1995. It's a mix of public service, Australian Broadcasting Corporation and the Special Broadcasting Service, and commercial broadcasting. And there are 2 national and 21 major city, daily, weekly newsprint editions, including their weekend editions. There's been, in terms of regulation, there's been ownership regulation in place since 1935 for radio and 1956 for television. Australian press is largely unregulated except for cross-media ownership rules, which existed from 1935 to 2017. And that regulation's been significantly watered down over the past 15 years, particularly with legislative changes in 2006 and 2017. They have seen in 2006 the removal of restrictions on foreign ownership, a policy silence on subscription television, which has remained outside the regulatory framework essentially, and that saw an initial concentration of radio and television license holders and reduced players in the media. The 2017 legislative changes effectively ended media concentration regulation. Things like the limit on population reach at 75% for television was removed. The 2 out of 3 rule that you could own a radio, television, and or newsprint service in a particular license area, but not all 3, you could own 2 of them, that was removed. And what is left is just limitations now on you can't hold 2 commercial television licenses in the same area or 3 radio. And that's led to this wave of consolidation post-2017. The former Packer-owned Nine Entertainment purchased the historically significant, long-standing Fairfax Media's print assets and radio assets, a company called Macquarie Media Assets, Seven West Media, one of the others. I'll show you I'll speak of some of the data in a minute. sought to purchase regional broadcaster Prime Media, eventually was able to do that late last year. Another company, Australian Community Media, purchased 160 of Nine's then recently acquired regional print assets. And while all that was going on, because of the previous legislative changes, what was then CBS, later Viacom, now Paramount Global, bought the third major commercial network in Australia, the 10 network. So Australian media, as Bene said at the very beginning, heavily concentrated and increasingly concentrated in the hands of three companies: News Corporation, Nine Entertainment, and Seven West Media. They control 97% of the national and large metropolitan city newspaper market. And that's up from an incredible 94% from 2011. Ownership is more concentrated than in countries such as the United Kingdom. And News Corporation, as we heard before, is the unchallenged dominant player in print. It's increased its percentage of print media share from 25% in the mid-80s to 59%. Nine Entertainment is second with 23%. Seven West Media has 15%. I'm sorry for all the figures, and I don't expect you to even remember all of these, but what I want to do is keep just quickly going through all of these. You'll see something start to occur with the repetition of these companies. First here in print, and I'll talk about online and then television and radio very quickly. There is competition between newspapers in only two cities, Sydney and Melbourne. The print circulation, yes, like elsewhere, is decreasing. But these companies set the news agenda across the country and across platforms. Large print businesses are gaining significant online readership, and 6 of the top 10 news sites, as we put in our report, are controlled by those three companies. The top 10 online news sites are them. And in data I just had a look at for yesterday, from November 2021, 10 of the top 20 sites as at the end of November 2021 are controlled by News, Nine, and Seven. And if you exclude the aggregators on those sites, 10 of 15 news companies own the top 10 online news sites in Australia. In television, same names again, essentially 4 companies: News Corporation, Nine, Seven Media Holdings, and Viacom, Paramount Global, and 10, to own 90% of Australian media television revenue, subscription and advertising. 3 of them, 9, 7, and 10, control all of those most lucrative television licenses. 1 company, News Corporation's Foxtel, controls Australian subscription television. And between them, News Corp, 9, and 7 collect 80% of free-to-air and subscription television revenues. And News Corp has 40% of that television market revenue. So add that to their dominance of the print and online sector. As I mentioned recently, one of those metropolitan companies purchased a regional broadcaster. 7 of our free-to-air television license owners has now become 6. And the 3 top companies now earn 82% of revenue, an increase in just 1 year. So in 2020, when we published the report, just to turn quickly to radio, and I'll finish then in a second, 3 companies, News Corporation and its associated entities, Nine, and another company, Southern Cross, which also owns regional television assets, control almost 100% of Australia's largest radio markets. And they earn 80% of the total revenues. Southern Cross is largest with 44%. And when we did the report, News Corp entities, ARN and Nova, earned 23% of those revenue. As a result of a purchase by Australian Radio Network, ARN, of a regional radio broadcaster last year, News has increased its 23% to 37% of the radio market. So it's an incredibly dominated market by just these three major players. And in cross media, 9 and 7 control 2 of the 3 television licenses in the main cities and 40% of the capital city print media. News dominates print with 60% of revenue, 59% of readership, and is the only subscription television service. But of course, market dominates dominance leverages control into regional markets, either through direct ownership and content licensing deal. And of course, there's an increased networking and syndication of content that in turn leads to closure of local print and online services, radio services, and newsrooms. Now, I apologise that that's such a massive amount of information in a very short space of time, but I wanted to give a sense of the data that sits behind this extraordinary media concentration. And I'll hand it back to you, Bene.
Of cross-media concentration is extraordinary, something that we rarely see in other liberal democracies. So now we're moving to Tosca, and we want to hear about also the challenges, the obstacles, and the aims of the campaign that was run also during the media diversity inquiry. Tosca, thank you.
Thank you, Bene. I'd also like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm calling in from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I think it's especially important on this call as part of a British event and an event about democracy to recognise that sovereignty was never ceded here in Australia. This land has a dark history of genocide at the hands of that invasion, so I'd like to recognise the strength and resilience of those whose ongoing effort to promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures will leave a lasting legacy for our future. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you, Bene. I thought I'd give a little bit of a background about the campaign for media diversity here in Australia. As Bene said, I work for GetUp, the biggest independent progressive campaigning organisation in Australia. And in recent years, our movement has become one of the fiercest critics of the influence of the Murdoch press on our democracy. There's really no use beating around the bush about it, because when we talk about media concentration in Australia, as Michael has just outlined, we really are talking about the Murdoch-owned press as a key aspect of that, not only because it is the dominant and unchallenged player in our media landscape. Michael's just outlined that, the majority of local regional newspapers, titles, metro, national readership, radio and online as well. But because the Murdoch press provides the sort of sharpest example of how within a concentrated media, that is where media power is concentrated, corporations can use their power to negatively influence democracy, our policy, our elections, our communities. And one of the clearest examples is News Corp's climate skepticism. And I suspect that this will come up much in the discussion, but in 2020, GetUp commissioned research that clearly demonstrated a campaign by News Corp Australia against effective public policy to address climate change. And that's not all. Their disinformation around the 2020 bushfires here in Australia and then the pandemic was so transparent that what we've really seen is a real shift in public engagement on the issue of media diversity and a reaction against the influence of the Murdoch press in Australia in recent years. And yep, Bene touched on it. This sort of shift culminated in one of the the biggest parliamentary e-petition Australia has ever seen. Sort of everyday people calling for an investigation into the influence of the Murdoch press. And it got so many signatures that the parliamentary site crashed. It was massive. And Senator Hanson-Young, who's joining us tonight, no doubt will speak to this, but this sort of wave of public support quickly led to a Senate inquiry into media diversity in Australia. And this inquiry presented a sort of massive opportunity to put the voices of communities at the heart of the conversation about media concentration in Australia. There's a chance to push for much needed reform on our regulatory framework, on investment in public interest journalism, and on the influence of the Murdoch press. So GetUp facilitated thousands of our members. We're a membership-based organisation with members across Australia to make submissions to the Senate committee about how media concentration affected them and their communities. And the stories were actually quite harrowing. These submissions showed sort of firsthand the effects of media deregulation on our communities, the stifling of public debate, the loss of local stories, from older folk losing touch with their communities to local councils being able to operate in the sort of shadows with no press scrutiny. I actually have a quote here from Judy from one of those submissions. She's from South Australia, which is the Senator's state. And I'm just going to read it out, actually, because I think it's worth hearing. Living in South Australia, we've been left with little local news content. Our print news at every level is from the Murdoch press. The Advertiser, the Sunday Mail, and the Australian. Even our local paper, The Messenger, was Murdoch Press owned, but it has been discontinued, so we even lack this as a connection with our local council community. Now we only receive a monthly newsletter from the council, but this isn't journalism. It's missing the stories about what is happening in our community, what people are doing and achieving. We need local journalists to hold our council and businesses to account. All of this has been exacerbated by the loss of local South Australian content on our public broadcasting news due to government funding cuts. And if there is time in the discussion, we should totally be discussing the role of public broadcasters in a diverse media landscape, but we can come to that. So we're hearing from our members about the effects of media concentration, especially at a local level. But when we tried to find the data to support it, we found there really was a massive gap in research about just how concentrated Australia's media is, about distribution, about ownership, all the things Michael outlined a moment ago. And there was a reason we couldn't find it. Australia's media sector is plagued by a lack of transparency and public accountability. It is extremely difficult to access critical information about who owns and controls the media. And something we found was that there had been sort of a failure of corporations, government, and the regulatory agencies, everyone, to provide access to data on media consumption and ownership in Australia. So we set out to change that. We have sort of via the support of our members, that's sort of thousands of everyday people giving us very small donations, $20, $25, $30. We commissioned research to fill that gap and provide the Senate inquiry with the data they needed to see. And because without this transparency, without the sort of hard data that Michael just outlined, it is extremely difficult to hold the owners of media corporations to account for their actions, to even have a conversation about what needs to change and about reform. So we commissioned that research, and the authors, of course, were Bene and Michael, who are on this panel this morning. It's very early here. The sun is just rising, but I have to take a moment to say how delightful it's been working alongside them on this campaign. And I now have the very real pleasure of calling them both friends, which is really lovely. But Michael has just comprehensively covered what we found. Everything that Michael just went over, none of this information was sort of easily accessible before we did this research. I'm running a little bit out of time, so I won't labour the point, but because I'm sure we'll come back to it. But basically, broadly, that research revealed an exceptionally high ownership and consumption of News Corp, but also of the sort of deep concentration across media platforms, not just of Murdoch, but of the rest of the media sector, was really dominated by 2 to 3 other media conglomerates, and that concentration really has these sort of knock-on effects within our democracy, the sort of cross-media agenda setting, but also, as we just heard from Judy in Adelaide, South Australia is being felt at a very, very local level. I might quickly just go over the recommendations that were in that report. We recommended that media ownership laws should be sort of immediately overhauled, that our media regulator be given the power to effectively monitor and enforce those laws, and for an increase in public investment in news media. Let me just look at the time. Yep, cool. We sent this report to every MP and Senator in Australia with the help of our members. Bene and Michael travelled to Parliament House to discuss those findings with a bunch of pollies in Canberra in the lead up to the inquiry handing down its report. And I won't go into too much detail about the outcome of that inquiry, as I'm sure we'll dive into that. And I'm sure that the Senator has a bunch to say about that as the chair of that inquiry, except to say that the heart of our recommendations were reflected in that report, including the need to further investigate the Murdoch Press, that sort of need for reform of our media regulatory framework, and to protect it from corporate capture. And I think the really key next step is ensuring that those recommendations don't gather dust on a Senate shelf somewhere. But of course, GetUp has a plan to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I'm really excited to hear from Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, who chaired that inquiry, about how we can ensure that that doesn't happen. Otherwise, I'll hand back to you, Bene.
Thank you, Tosca. And now we're moving to Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, and of course, she's going to tell us everything about the inquiry, possibly everything that she can possibly tell us. And Sarah Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Bene, and thank you to both Tosca and Michael for your presentations this morning already. You've covered a lot of the reason why we needed to conduct a parliamentary inquiry. There's obviously the figures that are just extraordinary outlined by Michael and that really paint the picture as to why media concentration in Australia is by far the worst when it comes to liberal democracies around the world. And then, of course, the growing concern amongst the Australian community and the voting public in relation to the impact that this media concentration is having on their lives, their communities, and their ability to engage effectively and honestly with the democratic process. It's no wonder that politicians have traditionally been afraid to talk about these issues and to take these issues on when the media concentration in this country is so high. When you are, as a politician, needing to use the media, engage with the media to get your message out to your voters and your community, the last thing you want to do as a politician is upset the media moguls. And that is what we've seen over time. And that's why when Michael was outlining the decline in media diversity in Australia, the decline in regulation, and the increase of concentration, now to a point where three main companies control over 98% of the media in Australia, politicians are very hesitant to step forward and say, actually, we have a problem here. And that is why this Senate inquiry was extraordinary, because despite that tension between the Parliament, politicians and political parties, and the power of the media, the Parliament acted because of this huge, extraordinary wave of concern coming forward from the Australian public. 500,000 people called on the Parliament to act. So we conducted an inquiry. I chaired that as outlined. It went for over a year. We took evidence from media companies themselves, the managing directors, the CEOs, the senior editors. We talked to former journalists who'd worked at companies like News Corporation about their experience. We took a number of submissions from whistleblowers within the main media organisations and companies. And we talked to individuals and organisations that had been at the front of unfair media coverage and the kind of at the forefront of what happens when there isn't media diversity. There's a couple of key things that we found. One was that the regulation and the regulatory system here in Australia is just not fit for purpose. It has been watered down over time, which has allowed that media concentration to grow, to the power of the representation of what's happening in our communities, our parliaments, our public institutions to be funneled through three key voices. And of course, overarchingly, the most concentrated of that being the Murdoch press through News Corporation. We found that those regulations are nowhere near fit for purpose for dealing with these massive monsters that these media companies have now grown to, and particularly the monster of all monsters, which has become the Murdoch press. We know that the regulations are not fit for purpose because they aren't taking into consideration the power of these companies in the online space, the ballooning of reach because of digital media. The regulations are not fit for purpose because they don't take into consideration the impact that the big social media giants are having on the distribution of media in Australia, and indeed, of course, around the rest of the world. We're talking here about big multinational media giants like Facebook and Google. It also was quite clear that with a decline in funding and support parliamentary and government support for our public broadcasters, that overwhelming concentration of media by News Corporation, and particularly second to that, the Nine media company, that the public broadcasters, which is our ABC, our equivalent of the BBC and SBS, were just not able to compete. They haven't been able to kind of balance out media influence in this country. Why is this all important? It's important because of democracy. And one of the key issues that we've seen has been stifled because of this media concentration in Australia has been the issue of climate change and climate action. Australia remains an outlier in the rest of the world, particularly those liberal democracies, when it comes to putting in place policies and action to deal with climate change. Only yesterday, we heard Mr. Guterres, the head of the United Nations, the president of the United Nations, call Australia out as effectively being a handbrake on climate action around the rest of the world. Australia exports some of the highest levels of fossil fuels to the rest of the world. We're one of the world's largest exporters of fossil fuels. That, of course, contributing to global warming, and of course making it harder and harder for the entire world to transition to the clean energy future that we need. But here in Australia, the way these issues are talked about has been stifled and in many cases misrepresented because of the agenda that has been set and driven by the concentration of media, and in particular the Murdoch press. That really culminated here in Australia in the midst of the huge summer bushfires that we had over the 2019-2020 summer, when huge parts of Australia, particularly on the east coast, were on fire. Homes were destroyed, towns were evacuated, our cities were engulfed in smoke. And of course, the rest of the world was watching on with horror that this was climate change unfolding before our eyes. And at the same time, we had the main media company in Australia downplaying the impact of these fires and the impact that climate change was having on these wildfires. So it was a very stark representation of when you have too much concentration in the media, you have politicians that are too timid to call out and to regulate, that the information that the public and the community were getting about what was going on, the causes, and what needs to happen in response was just missing. And as the rest of the world was talking about this as a live demonstration of the real threats of climate change, what Australians were getting was misinformation and a divergence of that expert view. Of course, we know that even James Murdoch, formerly on the board of News Corporation, has called out that misinformation and in fact the deliberate misinformation in relation to climate change by his father's own company. There's a lot that needs to be done in this space, and one of the key things is making sure our regulations are fit for purpose. We've called, as a result of this Senate inquiry, this parliamentary inquiry, for a new regulator, a single regulator that could cover not just the press space and the TV and the radio, but also online, because we know that that is where people are getting access to their news and information now more than ever. So we need to bring these, all of these elements of the distribution of information under the same banner. We have called for a royal commission, which would be a commission with a judicial inquiry with the powers of a royal commission, so that we could subpoena the core information from these companies. As the parliamentary inquiry unfolded, we called as witnesses numerous heads of News Corporation, for example, to head our inquiry. Some appeared and some others didn't. They were very reluctant to participate in many ways. And of course, the pressures that we then heard from whistleblowers about the extent of influence and control, the editorial control on a daily basis of journalists and editorial staff was significant. We heard from whistleblowers who worked within News Corporation that they were told to run certain stories and to leave others alone if it didn't fit their political agenda. We heard from former prime ministers in Australia that they felt under pressure and intimidated to not upset those in the Murdoch press by fear that there would be a campaign, a public campaign through newspapers, through television, through radio, through online against them and their chances at election time. It was put very clearly to us that it is the Murdoch press in Australia that dictates who wins elections, right down to it being concentrated by Mr. Rupert Murdoch himself, that he took great pleasure in being able to pick winners and losers come election time. And this is, of course, a threat to democracy, to the transparency of how our parliamentary system and our election system works. And of course, Australians now, as we can see by the huge community reaction, are becoming more and more frustrated and more sus of the media that they have access to. But this, of course, is a terrible indictment, because if you have 97% of Australia's media controlled by three main companies, and overwhelmingly by one, that being the News Corporation, and yet Australians are increasingly distrusting of this media and this the journalism that is coming forward, then of course that leads to broader issues of social isolation, distrust in public institutions, distrust in democracy, distrust in the whole parliamentary system. This is not a healthy position for a liberal democracy like Australia. The community, individuals, voters need to feel a sense of trust when they open up the newspaper or they look at their news feed on their phone in the mornings or on the bus on the way to work or when they get home. They have to feel as though the information, the official information they're getting from professional news organisations is correct, is true, is transparent. And what we're seeing increasingly here in Australia is not only is the public's trust disappearing that what the news they're consuming is real, but of course increasingly media organisations are taking advantage of that for their own power and influence. Climate change is one example. The representation of women is another example. The representation and the stories, local stories that are told about our communities, the diversity of those who live in our communities and their needs, of course, contributes to all of this. So I'm looking forward to some questions. Please put in the chat box if you want to know specifics. But overarchingly, the main issue here is a highly concentrated media has gotten too big for its own boots, now tells its own stories, not the stories of the community, of what is really happening in Australia on the ground or in our parliaments, in our local councils, in our state governments, and indeed the public can see that for what it is. This is bad for democracy. It weakens trust in our public institutions, and that is fundamentally why we need to tackle it. Thank you, Bene.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this really, really very, fascinating, but also full of details account of what is going on in the country. Actually, when you were talking, I was almost feeling I was living through again the Leveson inquiry, because there are so many similarities with the time in the UK, where, you know, politicians were constantly going, you know, in front of Leveson and saying that they were feeling intimidated, where, you know, the distrust for the public system and the parliamentary governance, you know, was its, you know, worst in the UK, and also where, you know, everybody was feeling that they needed to have the support of the Murdoch press in a way or another to be able to contest the election, to be able to have a chance in the election. So my question, I suppose, for everybody in the panel is, what happens next? And, you know, what are the chances, considering a very close election, of getting some of the recommendation, you know, implemented? And what do you think, you know, that it will happen in the next 6 months, for example?
Well, of course, Bene, we have a federal election here in Australia in the next 2 months. It'll be sometime in May. And after that, we don't know whether the current government will continue to exist or whether there'll be a change of government. But I think there will be a real sense of an expectation that there is a change in relation to the regulatory framework of Australian media, and of course a push for this type of judicial inquiry with the powers of a royal commission, particularly into how a single regulator in today's age would work and what type of influence, what type of power they should have. And I say that because we have to be careful that at the end of the day, press still needs to be free. It shouldn't be up to the government of the day or whichever political party is in power at that time gets to dictate what regulation exists. So we're very clear that the reason we need to have and we're very clear from the committee and the inquiry perspective that whatever judicial inquiry happens, it needs to be independent of politicians, and an independent regulator that is fit for purpose must be independent of politicians, and that's the only way it will work. Not just because that it makes sense for protecting a free press in Australia, but also because of the influence that the current stranglehold that the Murdoch press in particular, but the concentration of media has on politicians and political parties themselves right now, means that we need to make sure that politicians aren't just the puppets of those who own these big media companies like Rupert Murdoch and others. So I think there will be a significant move post the election in Australia to move on that recommendation. An independent regulator fit for purpose, whose the process, the terms of reference, the role of establishing that must be done by a separate, expert, independent judicial inquiry.
Thank you, Sarah. And actually, on this, we're receiving many questions from the public, and there is one that particularly asks about the problem of regulatory capture, and tell us more really about the independent authority and the current problems that the independent authority is facing in Australia. So maybe I wanted to go to Michael and ask him what's not working at the moment, and in your view, what can be done about it? What are the major recommendations that you might want to share with the panel?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's been mentioned a couple of times. The Australian Communication and Media Authority is Australia's communications media authority. It's a single agency like Ofcom, and at that point, every comparison to UK, whatever issues about Ofcom that people in the UK might have, end. There is one of the things that we put in the report that Tosca mentioned is that we really do need a regulator with teeth. We need a regulator that's independent, as Senator Hanson-Young just said. And whether or not it needs an enhanced legislative authority is questionable, because it has a fair amount of authority, but does seem to have, and it's interesting, just taking up Senator Hanson-Young's point, that there does seem to be just a little bit too much control from the government of the day via the cabinet and the minister. The issues for the the regulatory area are the ones that we've kind of talked about, where we've got a deregulatory framework. So significant areas are not captured in the regulations at all, and those that, to the limited extent that are captured, are only in a limited way. But one of the first kind of even more straightforward ways of doing things is about the data, transparency about who owns what, where they own it, where there are the media deserts. We've heard several times now about the decrease in media coverage in regional areas, in local communities, in suburban areas of even our biggest cities. We don't have information in these areas that's comprehensive, except for the fact that organisations like GetUp and other organisations are trying to capture the data and put it out into the community and tell us just what's wrong. We see it happening, and when things go wrong in crises. Once again, one of the comments about the terrible floods that have just hit parts of Eastern Australia, where a year's amount of rain has fallen in a week, was the lack of local news services, the lack of local journalists on site with local knowledge and able to bring those stories to their local communities, regional, state, national and international communities. I mean, it's a real telling aspect of this. And we don't have a regulator that has the mandate, at least as it understands it, so it needs to be more independent. And that independence that Senator Hanson-Young spoke about, of course, is one of the great transparency and independence, one of the great objectives of all of this, but a mandate to seek information and to provide information to the community on a regular basis. Plurality reviews, public reports on market status, to be able to put together the kind of data that we're talking about here today and present it on a regular basis to the community.
So on the community issue, maybe Tosca, you want to jump in.
Yeah, I might actually pick up on something that Michael just mentioned, which is that ACMA actually has these very broad powers. And this is something that came through when we were doing this research. We actually found that they actually have these amazingly broad powers to provide to sort of assess and monitor our media. The question is, why aren't they using them? And it feels like there's a real balance here with what the Senator and what Michael are talking about, where there is a balance to be had here, that we need to ensure a free press, but also the sort of obsession by our current government, our current Conservative government, with deregulation has meant this sort of corporate capture of our regulatory environment and our framework. I mean, I kind of want to throw it back on you, Bene, because you talk about corporate capture and regulatory capture so well. But, this is a classic instance of where an excess of power within the corporate environment is dictating how and when, how our legislation plays out in our communities. And it's interesting that we mentioned, the fact that you mentioned the Levinson inquiry, where there are a number of former prime ministers, UK prime ministers, who gave evidence at that inquiry, and so too in our inquiry in Australia, 2 former prime ministers. The question is, why are they all former prime ministers? There is a question of, why is there so much power within our media that is dominating not only the deregulation of the whole framework, but also of the regulatory structures that currently exist are not even able to operate because of that kind of power. But I don't know, Bene, you talk about corporate capture so well. I don't know if you want to comment on, I know it's bad form to call on the host, but if you have any comments about the regulatory capture as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So one of the issues, considering that we're always looking at a variety of case studies and the way in which concentration impacts, right? And we're talking only about Western liberal democracy. I want to be clear about this. But unfortunately, what we see is precisely that it's the regulatory capture leads to a public policy control as well. And we saw evidence of this, of course, like especially when we have to develop, for example, communication policies, right? So, for example, even in the UK, it was, at times very, very difficult not to feel, the presence of, of the media moguls in determining very crucial policy making. For example, I'll never forget, the major, former Prime Minister quote. He was saying that he had this conversation with Murdoch during the Leveson inquiry. Basically, he was finally reporting about this, and he was feeling under pressure by Murdoch for his European policy. And then we know how Major got defeated in the following election. So, and that was at the time a major issue for the UK, and not to mention also the stand that the Murdoch press took during Brexit, in the Brexit campaign, for example. So these are actually great examples of where regulatory capture and corporate capture really coming from these major corporations is impacting policy. And I think that actually the best comparison that we can always draw with Australia is what's happening to your climate policy, because clearly, when we look at the data from the 90s, there was an incredible awareness in terms of climate change, of Australian citizens. And when we look at actually the data now, finally, the Australian public is waking up to this dramatic media emergency that you're facing. But you can see that a lot gets constantly challenged. And of course, in the public mind, the problem becomes if we are told 1 million times that the bushfires are actually not caused by climate change, but are caused by arson, and perhaps the policy coming from the Greens, which is actually something that I found very often, reported between the end of 2019, the beginning of, during the bushfire seasons. Well, then, of course, if the public keeps getting repeated, the same thing many times, this is another great classic example of the way in which propaganda can affect the public mind. So, the question really is, how do we get out of this? How do we get out of this cycle, right? So on the one hand, you have politicians that are afraid of the media. On the other, you know that politicians feel that they have to comply a little bit, not to render the opposition of these media moguls too intense, so that they can still win the election. So this is basically always the issue, in cases of media concentrations in liberal democracy. And I think that actually I want to ask you, also because you're participating heavily, of course, in the debate, from here to the election. So, for example, Tosca, what is GetUp thinking of doing in terms of the pressure? And then I have a question for the panel, because we have a very international audience. We have media reformers connecting from the US, also connected to Free Press, which is another major global movement. And then, we are in London, broadcasting in London at the moment, where the Media Reform Coalition is very active. What can media reformers around the world do to help this situation as well? So 2 questions in one.
Okay, I'll jump on the first one. So yes, as we mentioned, there are some pretty amazing recommendations that came out of the inquiry that the Senator chaired, and we're very keen for them not to gather dust on a shelf. We want them enacted. We want that pressure. Whoever forms government in 7 to 9 weeks' time. The Senator mentioned we're deep in the middle of a federal election campaign here. It's just about to sort of kick off in earnest. And we want to make sure that whoever wins that election, whatever happens come the end of May, that we can sort of pick up this campaign and ensure that those recommendations get enacted. And so we're not taking any chances. Our members have already jumped on another piece of research that we want to, and that we're kicking off sort of this week, actually, to basically monitor the Murdoch press within this federal election, and to come out of the election with a basically a content analysis, to look at the Murdoch press's coverage and influence and trends throughout this election. And I think what's interesting is, we've already spoken about their role in UK elections, and it's no different here in 2020 2010 with the Murdoch press really pushing forward as a sort of fossil fuel interests in that election. 2018 in our Victorian state election, that sort of horrific racism that dominated that election coverage. They're really very, very active in those elections, and we heard from both Kevin Rudd, a former Labor Prime Minister, and Malcolm Turnbull, a Liberal or Conservative Prime Minister, who both gave evidence at the inquiry that it's no different here. So I think the difference, though, is that this election comes after 2 years of increased public engagement on the issue, increased public awareness of the Murdoch press's influence. And we have touched on the bushfires. I think that public engagement really has been kicked off sort of in the lead up to what brought sort of now. Over the past 2 years, there have been some really significant events that have really increased that public engagement. We've mentioned the bushfires, and to spell that out a little bit, as the bushfires were really just decimating large parts of the eastern coast, but other parts of Australia as well, South Australia, Kangaroo Island in particular. We have a public broadcaster, a drastically underfunded public broadcaster, which we should totally talk about later, really quite literally saving lives throughout those bushfires, giving people the sort of critical information that they needed. And then on the flip side, we have News Corp, which was, unleashing a kind of vicious campaign of disinformation. And this isn't just, the progressive side of Australia that's picking up on this. I mean, Al Jazeera, New York Times, the international headlines about News Corp's coverage of Australia's bushfires really called out a very obvious campaign against the public interest. And then that was quickly followed by the pandemic, where again, we saw a kind of campaign of misinformation, quite dangerous misinformation and racism in Australia. And these were both happening at the same time as the effects of deregulation, especially of some 2017 changes by that said Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who he himself scrapped the sort of last bastion of our regulatory framework in 2017, that our community is starting to feel that deregulation on a ground level. And I already read out a quote. There's many, many more like them of people starting to feel that. So, I think what's different about right now and why we want to do this research now for post-election is that public engagement we've never had before during a federal election. So not only do we have a federal election campaign or federal election period where we know that the Murdoch press will be pushing for their own interests and other corporate interests, and their ability to do so is at unprecedented levels because of their power in the media sector. We have that, but we also have a public awareness and public engagement that whatever happens at the federal election, we know that people are still going to want to talk about the Murdoch press more than ever before. And they're very, very aware of the kind of recommendations, or at least the push for further investigation. So right now, in terms of our next steps, we're doing that content analysis. We're looking at trends, and we're going to gather that data post-election. And no doubt, Senator, we'll see you in Canberra with that report, along with your colleagues, to kind of put that forward. Forgotten the second question, Bene, but maybe I'll throw it on.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. We have so many questions coming in also for the senator. So I want to start and kick into this question. One of the major questions is really what can media reformers and also citizens, from the countries that are watching us at the moment do, to put pressure and to make sure that these recommendations in the report can be implemented in a way or another. So the question is really, what can the international public and international public of media reformers do? And then there is another interesting question about the role of the liberals in Australia. So they're saying that in the UK, the Conservatives seem not to care very much about the Murdoch press and they don't want to touch it. What are the liberals thinking? If you can tell us about some insights about where do you think they're heading? Thank you.
Both very good questions, Bene. Firstly, from an international perspective, I think a number of things that are helpful is one, News Corporation is a global corporation. They have outfits, and not just in Australia, of course, Fox News in the US, and many reaches into the UK as well. through the various press over there. This is going to take international pressure. Australia cannot do this on our own. The Murdoch empire has grown so large. I said at the beginning that the Murdoch press in Australia is the monster of all monsters when it comes to media concentration and their just arrogant, brazen execution of power and influence. Some have described, and I think this is rightly so, as a cancer on democracy. And that should be a concern to the rest of the world, particularly other liberal democracies. So I think for those international organisations taking up this fight in your own, through your own jurisdictions, reporting what is happening, helping the campaigns would be good and very helpful. Of course, as a politician who has stood up and put my neck out on this, it doesn't come easily. This comes at a cost. Tosca mentioned that I'm from South Australia, and the only media, the only daily newspaper in my state is Murdoch controlled. So, you know, you can imagine the cost personally and politically that this takes on a member of parliament like myself to stand up when there is no alternative media to communicate through and to tell your stories, to reach my community and constituents. So there's a constant balance here. I've, of course, decided that this is a much bigger issue, that this is fundamental for democracy, that this is fundamental if we are to tackle the climate crisis, which is why I'm taking this on so strongly. But I think from an international sphere, those who can help highlight and support those of us who are willing to stick our necks out is an important thing to do. In terms of the second question, what does the Conservative Party, ironically named the Liberals here in Australia, think about this? I think there is a growing concern amongst some that this monster has grown too big. There is general concern amongst some that this has been a handbrake and that the difficulty to now prosecute genuine climate action and policy is holding their own party back now. Those who clearly understand the science, understand the economic cost of not taking action and the future economic cost to Australia if we continue to be holdouts, as Antonio Guterres at the UN referred to Australia as only yesterday. This is going to have cost. And after years of the Murdoch press telling the public mistruths, disinformation in relation to this, it is very difficult now for the Conservative government to simply shift and to say, oh, well, for the economy, for the environment, we need to do this. So they've kind of backed themselves into a corner, which makes it very difficult. There are a number of MPs and people within the Conservative side who are very worried about that because now they look like hypocrites. The pressure is on. I also think, however, there is an opportunity because there is a growing concern about the influence of the tech giants and the social media giants in this space. And there is louder and louder and louder calls for regulation in relation to Facebook and Google, Twitter, those big media, social media giants. Now, in a liberal democracy and from a Conservative perspective, one would think if there is if regulation is fit for one sector of media, it should be fit and proper for another. So I think there is an opportunity to make sure that as we go forward, the Liberal Party here in Australia, for consistency, if they want regulation on the tech giants, they're going to have to also understand that that means regulation of the broader and today's media sphere as a whole.
Yeah, well, now we just received another question precisely on the now very famous news media bargaining code that prescribes in a way, if applied, that of course the big digital lords, as I prefer to call them, because I think tech giants doesn't reflect the incredible, almost feudal-like power that they have on citizens, but also on their very loyal servants that get locked in their platforms. So the code prescribes that digital lords have to negotiate. So Google and Facebook, Meta, have to negotiate with news organization so that they can support. And this is a policy that has been highly discussed around the world, and it's a policy that has, led to a very I would say, lively discussion internationally. What do you think about this policy? And I would like to open this to the entire panel, and starting with Michael. What do you think really about the news media bargaining code, and what can we know? Do we know actually the extent of which the bargaining code has led to more diversity?
No, we don't. And that's the bottom line. To pick up on the themes that have come out in the discussion about transparency, for example, the media bargaining code legislation doesn't provide any. The regulator, neither the Australian Competition Consumer Commission, which is empowered with this regulation, nor the ACMA have the power to know even who's doing the negotiation. They have no power to inquire and be told who's got deals. They have no power to be informed about what is the nature of those deals. Essentially, what is there is not a big stick, but a stick that can be used by the Australian government through the Treasurer if the feudal lords don't move. If they so choose, they are doing enough to avoid that. Apparently, there is a report that Treasury is to do quite soon, but it's an incredibly inadequate way to deal with this issue. I mean, Senator Hanson-Young was speaking just before about this issue. I think it's a really interesting point about media policy. Media policy in this country, perhaps elsewhere, is very segmented. So they've gone and talk about how incredibly problematic this extraordinary global economic and political phenomena is, and its influence on our social, cultural, and political world, and it needs some sort of regulation, which is very inadequate. But at the same time, we've got to do regulatory, an increasingly deregulatory approach in Australia. We've removed Australian content rules for commercial television for the first time. They've been cut in 60 years. Our public service broadcaster, the ABC, has had $1 billion taken out of it, while $700 million has been fed back into these commercial broadcasters by cuts in taxes, et cetera, over the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, but none of this is addressed as comprehensive media policy. And that, to me, is part of the problem that we face here at the moment. We aren't dealing with it like that.
Do we have any new data about the extent of which actually local and small publishers, because we've been talking a lot about local news deserts, and so independent and small publishers manage to be funded through the code? Do you have any evidence of this? And this is a question, of course, for Michael and the Senator.
Well, I'll just start by saying that only yesterday I saw an online petition from a small independent media organisation asking for some kind of assistance in this issue, policy assistance, because they can't get any traction to negotiate. They're not even they can't get in the door. The second Australian public service broadcaster, the Special Broadcasting Service, SBS, can't get to negotiate with them. Lots and lots. The concentration, like media power that we've just been talking about, on the deals, as we understand them by the statements made by the people who've actually completed deals, is in the hands of a small number of larger media organizations.
So, of course, because the world is watching Australia on this. So I'm very, very keen to get, the discussion going, because of course, we see, for example, the UK now, they just started in February, a UK inquiry into local news and local news desert and the sustainability of local news. And of course, whenever there is a lack of funding of public interest journalism, at the moment, because of the international debates around the digital lords, I would say that everybody thinks, okay, let's see how and when the bargaining code has worked in Australia. And this is true for the UK at this very moment. They just started inquiry, but it's also true, for example, for Canada. And I had many contacts with Canadian scholars and lawyers and reformers that were keen to understand. Because the point of the law and what the law aimed to do, which was really to try to get funding out of digital lords to fund local journalism, as merit, and we know about this. The problem is, the level of implementation, and this often, coming from Southern Europe and knowing how, Southern European policy can be developed, but then doesn't get implemented. I wonder really if you agree that so far the code is a success, and actually I think that you have highlighted, clearly, some of the obstacles for a very transparent implementation. So this is a caveat, of course, for other international jurisdictions that are looking to do something similar. Because if it didn't help media concentration, and if we know that independent local publishers are already struggling to get access, I know, for example, for a fact that The Conversation, which is another public interest newspaper, didn't get funded. And I know that other local news publishers didn't get any fund. So what would be your assessment of the code so far? And it's open to everybody.
Could I just jump in there, Bene? I think, yes, it has been world-leading legislation, and there is a genuine conversation that Australia has been having, and of course the rest of the world has been having, as to how we handle, as you described them, the digital lords. I quite like that. I haven't heard that description before. But also, yes, how do we actually support the upkeep, the investment in the funding of public interest journalism when these massive digital media companies are making huge profits off the back of other people's work? So, journalism is one area. I think there's a whole other swag of content creators who are being ripped off because of these big giants that are, really profiteering off other people's creativity and intellectual property. I think at this point there has been the success of this code is varied. We've had successful negotiations with some of, as Michael says, some of the bigger media players in Australia. We've had some success with the public broadcaster, the ABC, and they've actually been very grateful and thankful that they've been able to participate and get extra money that they are now sending into regional Australia to fund an expansion of public interest journalism there. However, there are others that have not been able to negotiate. There are some smaller players who actually had struck deals earlier on and have been successful, but it's Facebook in particular tends to be the big holdout on this. I think it's fair to say that Google has negotiated in a much fairer way and perhaps have seen the writing on the wall, but they don't want to be the bad guy and to leave the bad guy role up to Facebook, who of course are on the nose, not just here in Australia, but increasingly the US, facing various Senate inquiries in the US and elsewhere. I think the public's increasing disdain and suspicion about Facebook is only growing, and politicians are picking up on that. and of course, other media companies and digital media companies are watching the failure of Facebook to engage on in a discussion about a regulatory framework, and now they're being shut out and branded as being bad behaviours. So I think we've still got a long way to go to see where this shakes out. There is a review that is due this year. That will be really important. And in the international context, for those watching, that review is going to be really, really important. It's not going to happen before the election here in Australia, but post-election, that will be a really important process to watch and to be engaged in. And I think, as Michael has already said, the key here is going to be transparency. Where are the extra investments in public interest journalism that have come from this? How have the media companies grown or contracted since this code has been put in place? And at the end of the day, there is the power of the Parliament now to turn up the heat with that piece of legislation through designation. And if that has to happen, I'm of the view that designation, if that's the rule you set, then that's the rule you should probably go for. I'm probably more leaning towards the idea that we should just designate and get it done. Use that key power so there isn't it isn't left in the hands of politicians and them being under the influence or friends with particular media organisations. Let's just have a clear regulation that covers everybody and everybody knows what the impact is. That's what I'll be pushing for throughout the next few months, and I'll be looking towards the review to underpin a campaign for that.
Very good, and I wanted to thank the senator because she has to leave for another commitment. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been incredibly relevant and brilliant also for our international public. I'll keep up the conversation, and I wanted to pick up on something about the ABC, because I think it's another topic that we haven't explored yet, but the ABC is the Australian BBC and has been struggling for years now. So can you tell us a little bit more about this for the international public, and also, of course, in terms of the kind of concentration, because public service media are traditionally also, the guardians of the public sphere, of course, but are supposed also to help with the problem of commercial media concentration, at least providing something different.
Did you want me to start, Bene?
To both Tosca and Michael.
Can I just make a comment quickly on what the senator said about that, the ABC being sort of grateful for that. I mean, of course, the ABC is grateful for that money because they've been so drastically underfunded by the current coalition government, 3 terms of the coalition government, not just cutting funding and cutting the fat, as they say, but actually a campaign of by Senator, trying to undermine the ability of our public broadcaster to service our communities. And that has been a coordinated effort between the Murdoch press and the coalition government. And I'll do a quick plug for a film that GetUp made called Morrison and Murdoch versus the ABC. It features Michael in it. And that really talks about that coordinated campaign. But of course, they're grateful. But the point here is that the ABC shouldn't be getting funding from the digital lords, as Bene has been calling them. They should be getting funding from the state. And I think that there's a real hypocrisy here in this current coalition government. I'll call them the Conservative government for the international audience, a current Conservative government trying to regulate the media environment or going in for almost subsidies or regulation where it suits them. So, for example, they massively subsidize our fossil fuel efforts and yet gloriously talk about the need for an open and fair market. And one of the key reasons behind the deregulation of our current media environment was about the market and about preserving the market. And I'm sure Michael can speak more to that as well. But here they are suddenly interested in regulating our parts, a very particular part of our media environment. And of course, that's because it benefits the most powerful in the media media sector. It benefits, as we've already touched on, I think something like, even in the first week after that code came through, said 90% of the funds were going to the big three. And that is not, it's not just not addressing media diversity or media concentration, rather, it's making it worse. And I'm sorry that the senator left, because I know the senator had a lot to do with that code. But I would warn our international international sort of reform coalitions like the Media Reform Coalition, who are looking at the Australian example and looking to implement it elsewhere, is that if we're talking about media concentration, this isn't the answer. And we need to talk about regulation across the board that is fair and has at its heart communities and public interest journalism and democracy, rather than the profit of the corporates, because this sort of hypocrisy of subsidising and regulation where it suits Murdoch, let's be honest, and not where it serves as, say, for example, the Illawarra Mercury, which is my local paper, these sort of more independent, smaller papers that tell local stories. They're the ones who are really missing out. But yeah, I just wanted to point out, first of all, on the public broadcasting comment, that Australia's public broadcasters have been drastically underfunded, and not just underfunded by the Conservative government, but a vicious campaign by the corporate media, by the Murdoch press, to sort of exacerbate and accelerate that underfunding because of money, because our public broadcasters are taking away their clients, their customers, despite the fact that these services are critical in any democracy, that we have media that is immune and separate from corporate interests and the flows of the market.
And
but,
on that note,
sorry,
on that note, I wanted to ask Michael, because I know that there is new research that he has done specifically on the issue of the funds that have been given by successive Australian governments to commercial media in a way or another. Which I think it's really crucial, because, you know, the debate is always trying to reduce the public funds for public service broadcasters, but this governments have given huge amount of money to commercial broadcasters. How did it happen, Michael?
Yeah, well, as $1 billion has been ripped out of the ABC, and if anyone has the access to the GetUp report, on page 31, there's a table that shows just how that happened. As that's occurred over almost the same time period, but a little bit shorter, 5 years, the government, the current Australian government, has reduced the broadcasting license fee for the use of spectrum from $130 to $40 million a year, a gift of $90 million a year to the commercial sector. They're proposing to remove it entirely at the moment. They've reduced the Australian content rules for commercial free-to-air television and radio, and that's going to give them another $50 or $60 million a year. They introduced COVID emergency legislation to wipe out the need to do any content, Australian content regulatory requirements for 1 year and possibly 2 in 2020. And they also had a public interest news gathering fund worth $50 million that was also brought in at that time to deal with some of the issues that we've been talking about at the moment. Of that, the research that we did showed that of that, $42 million of that went to the very big media corporations that we've been talking about today. All told, and another $20 million went for international broadcasting in the Asia Pacific region to commercial entities that taken away from the ABC. Now, all up, around $670 million was gifted to these commercial broadcasters, while we have public service media being slashed. Now, it's not an accident. I mean, this is media policy at work.
Mm-mm.
Well, or actually big media policy coming from the big
media policy, exactly. Yeah. Because we should be seeing our state investing and giving money to public interest journalism. They should be supporting public interest journalism because it's an important part of our democracy and how we encourage the communication of not just government policy, but of stories. And I think with the introduction of these big tech giants, we need our government to be supporting that. So we do want them to be encouraging that kind of journalism. But as Michael says, as Bene just said, it's big media policy. It's where that money's going to. It's putting, it's the government saying that they're going to, they're putting money towards the, televising of women's sport, but then putting it behind Foxtel's paywall. Or it's at the same time as taking money away from our public broadcaster, which we know is the most trusted news source in Australia. So I think we do want that kind of, and one of the key recommendations from the inquiry was that kind of investment in public interest journalism, but it should be coming from the state, and primarily because that's how we can ensure that it's going to the right places in our communities. I suppose one thing I'd say with just a few more minutes to go, is Senator Sarah Hanson-Young mentioned the kinds of attacks that she got. And for our international audience, I don't know if you can imagine, but the attacks are heinous. I mean, the kind of, when the Murdoch press gets you in their sort of crosshairs, the kind of really misogynistic and character assassination that they go for is intense. And GetUp is the target of many of those attacks, but we wear it as a kind of badge of honor that we're doing our work well. But I would say one thing about why they dislike GetUp so much. I mean, News Corp really dislikes GetUp, and it's because I think that we have quite a lot of power. I mean, there is a reason why we don't have we only have former prime ministers speaking out against News Corp. I mean, people are, as Senator Sarah Hanson-Young mentioned, or shy. We call Senator Sarah Hanson-Young shy for short. And so what she mentioned was, people are scared. Politicians are very, very scared to speak out. And because if you do, it's very likely you'll lose your seat. So I think what's really important about these sort of community movements, these movements of everyday people like GetUp, our work is, entirely funded by these small donations of everyday people like Julie, who I mentioned before, people like my dad, our neighbours, etc., who can come together, and it doesn't matter what the Murdoch press says about you. You can kind of form this kind of movement of people taking action to change the status quo, and that's really important when you see the sort of regulatory capture that we've already spoken about, but also a sort of political hostage situation with the Murdoch press. And I think that there's been some really interesting instances in the UK where communities have come together and banned the Murdoch press from their towns. And I think that that's really, really exciting. And I'm hoping to see more and more of that as we move forward in Australia, as sort of a movement of everyday people who are standing up against the Murdoch press, not just because of their domination in the media sector, but because of the kind of disinformation and vitriol that are coming from them. So I suppose just to comment about why community efforts are so important when we're talking about big, powerful bodies like the Murdoch media. But over to you guys.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think Michael had another comment, and I wanted to actually give you the chance because we have just a few minutes, and then we'll have to close.
All right. The one other thing I wanted to add, and it moves from Tosca's acting locally, thinking globally, and acting globally as well. And that's the question that came up earlier about international. What can we do at international levels? And I think one of the things is more research on, more analysis of what our regulatory and different national regulatory arrangements are, and data such as that we've put together here, just to simply know what's happening in other countries. And organizations like GetUp and others active in this sort of field can take the most prosaic of data and be able then to push that along in campaigns. And that gives local, national and global organizations the opportunity to be doing something.
Absolutely. And actually, I just also want to tell our public in the UK and in the US that it's been incredibly difficult to get the conversation about this type of media reform efforts in the mainstream media conversation. And I'm sure that you now understand why. Of course, I mentioned many of the detrimental effects on democracy of media concentration, and certainly the lack of reporting on media policy advocacy and media reform efforts by communities, by parties that are actually really trying hard to achieve reform is one of them. So for sure, to get more international coverage also, as Tosca mentioned, for example, the relevance also for community at the local level of having seen exposed the misinformation around the bushfires by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, covering the misinformation by the Murdoch Press on the bushfires, not linking the bushfires to the climate crisis, was something that really helped also outraging the public. So I think that I'm really calling for more international collaboration on this, more international pressure, also from international newspapers. And I really hope that as many people have been watching this incredible debate and with full of details about what's going on in Australia as one of the most relevant example of what media concentration can do to a country. So a huge thanks to all our panelists today and for you for joining us and being part of this very important discussion. And finally, the Media Reform Coalition is a voluntary organization. Every single session is free, but if you'd like to make a donation to the running cost of the festival, there is a donation button on the website homepage. Check out the rest of the excellent session throughout the coming week, and of course the program on our website, which is mediareform.org.uk. And thank you very much. Please follow the festival during the week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Wow.